My name is Jory Van Cleve, and today we're going to be talking about abnormal pacemaker activity. Before we get into abnormal pacemaker activity, let's take a look at how the heart functions. The heart is an amazing organ that works nonstop without slowing down or tiring out. The average heart beats at a rate of 70 beats per minute. When you do the math on that, that is over 100,000 beats per day. The heart has a natural pacemaker that helps the heart stay in a steady rhythm. The heart cells that contain the quickest rate of action potential act as the pacemaker, which happens to be the sinoatrial node, or SA node. An action potential located in the SA node is responsible for the start of the contraction. The action potential in the SA node spreads through both the atria and into the atrioventricular node, or AV node. The AV node acts as a passageway into the ventricles where the action potential continues to spread. As it leaves the AV node, it will travel through the bundle of His or onto the Purkinje fibers. So notice in the figure, it starts and it shows the sinoatrial node and it shows the purple. So when you're looking at the purple, it shows the impulse traveling from the SA node to the walls of the atria, and when that happens, it causes it to contract. You then will notice that the impulse reaches the AV node, which delays it by about 0.1 seconds, and then it continues traveling down into the bottom of the ventricles. As it gets to the bottom of the ventricles, it starts filling up the ventricles, and the signal spreads through the ventricle walls, causing them to also contract. And so that's the way a normal pacemaker activity should look. Some cardiac cells function as pacemaker cells. The pacemaker cells have unstable resting potentials and can spontaneously depolarize. The sinoatrial or SA node is the main pacemaker site. However, the atrioventricular AV node, as well as the bundle of His and the Purkinje cells, have the ability to also spontaneously fire when needed. The heart will use the area with the fastest rate and use it as the pacemaker. So, for example, look at the illustration showing examples of pacemaker activity. You'll notice in figure A that is what a normal pacemaker activity looks like. We see that the SA node contains the fastest pace. Therefore, it leads the pack and sets the pace of the rhythm of the heart rate. However, if that SA node is not functioning correctly, the next fastest cell type will take over. So now look at example B. In example B, the SA node becomes non-functional, leaving the AV node to pick up the pace. The heart rate will continue at the rate the AV node was portraying. So if you notice, the SA node was the fastest, but it's now non-functional. So the next fastest cell was the AV node, with the Purkinje fibers being the slowest. So the AV node would pick up, and the rest of the train would occur at that. If you go on and look at example C, that's showing a heart block. This occurs when the AV node is non-functional. As you can see, the SA node is at a much faster pace than the Purkinje fibers located beyond the AV node. Without that connection, because the AV node is now non-functional, the steady heart rate cannot carry on. So this is going to cause an unsteady heart rate. So this is going to result in the atria beating at a faster pace than the ventricles, since the ventricles have to continue at their own pace because that connection with the AV node is no longer there. The last abnormal pacemaker activity shown is example D. In this scenario, an ectopic focus occurs due to the Purkinje fibers taking over. The ectopic focus causes the Purkinje fibers to beat at a much faster rate than the SA node. So this just gives a great example of using like trains and the cars in the trains as to how the rest of that train would carry on. So the same with the heart, depending on if it has that complete connection or if pieces of it are no longer functional. Arrhythmias are irregularities in the heart rate. There are two common classifications of arrhythmias based on where they occur. So if they begin in the ventricles, they're called ventricular. And when they begin in the atria, they are considered supraventricular. Supra meaning above. And so since it's above the ventricles, that's the atrium. When the heart rate falls below 60 beats per minute, it's commonly referred to as bradycardia. And when the heart rate rises above 100 beats per minute, it's commonly called tachycardia. So if you'll notice in the figure on this slide, you can see the normal heartbeat, what it should look like. It's got the P and R and S waves, and they're evenly spaced. If you see the tachycardia, you'll notice that those waves are much closer together. And then in the bradycardia, the waves are much further apart because they're slower. And then the bottom one just shows an irregular heartbeat. So you may have some that look like a regular heartbeat, and then all of a sudden there's a longer pause, and then there's a regular heartbeat again, and maybe a longer pause, or maybe even some closer together. And so the irregular heartbeat will look not in sync really at all. Premature atrial contractions, or PACs, are contractions in the atria that do not come from the SA node. They're commonly known as early extra beats. Most of the time, these phenomena are not considered to be dangerous. As a matter of fact, a lot of people don't even really realize that they are having them. And you can see in the figure, you can see a normal heart rate at the bottom. And at the top, you can kind of see some of those premature contractions where it's a little bit closer together, and then some are a little bit further apart. And you see a little bit more of a rise right before the peak. Our next one is atrial fibrillation. Atrial fibrillation is the result of rapid and chaotic firing in the upper chambers or atria of the heart. The rapid firing in the atria causes the signals to quiver. And so as the quivering continues, it makes it difficult to get all of the signals through the AV node. So you remember you go from the SA node, the AV node, to the ventricles. And so if you can't get all those signals through the AV node, it's hard for them to get to the ventricles. So the heart rate will become irregular, and a lot of times it becomes very fast. So remember that a normal heart rate averages 70 beats per minute. Atrial fibrillation can range anywhere from 100 to 175 beats per minute. And so you can notice in this picture, the first one is a normal heartbeat. You can see the evenly spaced. You can see the rises and falls are evenly spaced. Notice the impulse, how it carries from the SA node through the AV node and down into the ventricles. But then when you look at the atrial fibrillation, you can just see all the abnormal impulses and the chaotic firing all in the atrium and the atrial chambers. And so a lot of that doesn't get down into those ventricles. Our next one is the proximal supraventricular tachycardia. This occurs when the muscle in the atria sends out signals that become repetitive. And most of the time it's in a circular pattern. When this happens, it causes the heart rate to speed up. Studies have shown that there's no clear reason for this to happen, but they have found that it's more common in younger women. And you can just see in the picture how that tachycardia, they're closer together. Even the peaks are much higher, and they just have a more pronounced look to them. Okay, our next one is one of the most common supraventricular arrhythmias. It's caused by an extra pathway through the AV node, and it's called AV nodal reentrant tachycardia, also known as AVNRT. So it results in the conduction down the slow atrioventricular nodal pathway with a retrograde conduction up the fast pathway. This activity can cause a heart rate to reach between 118 to 264 beats per minute. And when you look at that picture, it shows the normal sinus rhythm, what it looks like on that ECG, shows the pathway through the heart. And then when you look at the next one, these are where there's some accessory pathways or bridges. And notice that pathway is in a circular motion to where the other one kind of went down, up, and around. This one just goes in a circular position. when you look at the tachycardia, you'll just kind of see they're closer together, and the peaks go down more than they do up. Premature ventricular contractions are our next one. These are also called PVCs. PVCs are a type of ventricular arrhythmias that occur due to extra beats that originate in one of the lower chambers of the heart. Instead of the signals beginning in the SA node, like a normal heartbeat, it comes from one of the ventricles instead. This is probably one of the most common things that happens. Lots of people have PVCs, some don't even realize it. But this occurs before the SA node ever has a chance to fire a signal. The misfired signal spreads through the entire heart, causing a premature beat. Most of the time, it can cause a person to feel as if their heart is skipping a beat. However, it's not skipping a beat, it's an extra beat thrown in there. I've actually experienced PVCs for the last 20 years, and this year they have become much more frequent. With this, I have felt for the last 20 years like fluttering in my chest, like you can just kind of feel that fluttering in your chest. But mine has become more and more frequent, and this summer I experienced tons of lightheadedness. Several times I've almost passed out from it, and so I went to the doctor, and they ended up giving me a beta blocker to help with that. Okay, our next one is ventricular tachycardia. Ventricular tachycardia is an arrhythmia that is the result of abnormal electrical signals in the lower chambers of the heart. These abnormal electrical signals cause chaotic heartbeats due to the confusion of signals. When this happens, the ventricles cannot fill with blood correctly, and as a result, the lungs and the rest of the body may not get enough blood pumped to them. There's many causes of this condition, ranging from structural abnormalities to sudden cardiac arrest. Someone with this ventricular tachycardia will experience a minimum of 3 consecutive heartbeats of a rate more than 100 beats per minute. Ventricular fibrillation is known as one of the most serious types of electrical disturbances the heart can experience. It's also known as VFib. VFib is caused by a pathway disturbance that causes an irregular heartbeat. These defective impulses cause the lower chambers to quiver and to not pump correctly. This results in the body getting no blood flow to any part of the body, including vital organs. Once the blood flow stops flowing, the organs begin to die, and CPR should be administered immediately. This type of arrhythmia is much more dire than atrial fibrillation. So my mother actually has experienced VFib. Several years ago, she was getting gas and knew that something was about to happen. She's a nurse, and so she thought quickly and went straight to the nearest place she could see that she knew would have a defibrillator, which was a Walgreens. So she pulled up to the Walgreens, went in, and just told them they needed to call 911 and to grab their defibrillator because they had about 1 minute before they were going to have to use it. They were able to shock her back as soon as she went unconscious and her heartbeat stopped beating. The ambulance arrived and she flatlined once again on the way to the hospital. They shocked her back again, and in the ER she experienced VFib for the 3rd time. The paddles didn't work that they used on her, but one of her friends that worked in the ER decided that she was going to climb on top of her and perform CPR until she got her back, and she did. She went into surgery and had a pacemaker defibrillator combination placed. This past May, she got a new combination placed in because her battery was dead. And then today, she actually went back into surgery because her alarm went off and she had some defective leads into the heart that were fractured and had to be replaced. So that is VFib, and it's one of the more dangerous of the arrhythmias that there are. Sinus node dysfunction is a result of a SA node to produce an adequate heart rate that is needed by an individual to meet their physiological needs. This irregularity is also known as the sick sinus syndrome. There are many symptoms or complications that are associated with this dysfunction. Bradycardia and sinus pauses can accompany sick sinus syndrome along with sinus exit blocks and other inadequate heart rate activity. Abnormal automaticity and conductivity can cause sinus node dysfunction. Other factors such as fibrosis and atherosclerosis can contribute to this abnormality as well. When examining the illustration, the series of pauses or blocks are evident, so you can just see the big long spaces between each of the heartbeats where the pauses are, where those dysfunctions are located. And one of the last things we're going to talk about are heart blocks. And there's many different types of heart blocks, but a heart block causes a delay or block of electrical impulses from the sinus node to the ventricles. Some heart blocks, such as sinoatrial exit blocks, are caused by a failure of the impulses to move beyond the SA node. When this happens, there's a failure of atrial depolarization, which is shown by the drop of P waves in the ECG illustration on the slide. There are different degrees of SA blocks. A first degree SA block is due to the delay between the start of an impulse to the transmission of it to the atrium. A second degree SA block type 1 is produced because of the lengthening of intervals between the start of an impulse and the transmission. Therefore, the transmission fails. A second degree SA block type 2 is signified by an intermittent drop of P waves with a constant interval between the start of an impulse and atrial depolarization. In a third degree SA block, none of the sinus impulses make it to the right atrium. There is also a complete absence of P waves, and long sinus pauses or sinus rest are possible. And you can just kind of see in the illustration on the slide the different pieces of the ECG and what those P waves look like, and the pauses where you see the longer pause between the heartbeats show the different types of SA blocks. And lastly, we're going to talk about a study being done about the regulation of ectopic pacemakers. So, as discussed earlier, the SA node is the pacemaker of the heart in normal circumstances. However, other parts of the heart can take up the slack and become the pacemaker when the SA node fails to do its job. The AV node, His bundles, and the Purkinje cells can all become pacemakers when needed. A study titled Sinus Node-like Pacemaker Mechanisms Regulate Ectopic Pacemaker Activity in the Adult Rat Atrioventricular Ring by Logentha et al. Was conducted to determine if the atrioventricular ring could act as a pacemaker. This group of individuals used adult mammalian hearts of the Wistar rats to conduct investigations identifying that the voltage clock mechanisms underlie ectopic pacemaking in the rats' atrioventricular rings. The hearts were prepared in a bath solution after the blood was cleared, and dissections were performed. The identification of the primary pacemaker site was located by the use of a multi-electrode array extracellular electrical mapping. The arrays were removed, and a sharp microelectrode technique recorded the intracellular action potentials. Quantitative PCR, immunohistochemistry, and Western blots were all used to gather more data, with the use of 12 hearts being used in the quantitative PCR and 5 hearts being studied with the Western blot. It was found that the atrioventricular rings of adult rat hearts can spontaneously become the pacemaker when the SA node does not function. Under abnormal conditions, like focal atrial tachycardia, the atrioventricular rings can become the ectopic pacemaker for the rat. And in the 2D computer simulations located on the slide, Figure A represents normal activation in the right atrium. The blue line represents the sinus node or resting potential. The red represents the action potential, and the green line represents the AV ring. Figure B shows a diseased sinus node where pacemaker activity is activated. Notice that the AV ring is elicited and continues through the atrium and suppresses the sinus node. Figure C shows 2 examples of premature ectopic beats developing in the AV ring. Just as the previous slides indicated, there are various parts of the heart that will become the pacemaker of the heart when the SA node is non-functional. This study proved that one small portion of the heart, known as the atrioventricular ring, can indeed become the pacemaker, just as other parts of the heart can.